I'm Kelsey Niena, this is the Orange Lily Project, and today with Biblical Interpretation, we're going to be talking about offerings and holidays. The first recorded offering in the Bible was done by Adam and Eve's first children, Cain and Abel. Cain, like cane sugar, worked the earth and did, crops and stuff, and Abel worked with animals. And there came a time in Genesis where both of them offered up, sacrifices unto the Lord. And while Abel gave the first fruits of his labors, he gave the best livestock to God, Cain gave some of the remnants and kept the first fruits for himself. And it said that God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's. So from the get-go, there's a precedent of God in the Bible not really being interested in the leftovers. He wants the first fruits because he's the one who provided them. A sacrifice and an offering of any kind should cost you. And from there, we already get a foretaste of what is to come in terms of what is expected of us and ultimately what it will be and is provided by God through Jesus. So fast forward a little bit, we have Abraham, who has finally had Isaac in his old age. He and Sarah have Isaac, and when Isaac is in his 20s, some scholars think, it varies from person to person, but the main thing is he was probably an adult. God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and he says, take your son, your only son whom you love, and give him to me as an offering, kill him. And Abraham says, okay, I'm not thrilled about this, but all right. And Abraham, trusting that God will raise Isaac from the dead to fulfill the promises that he made, takes Isaac to Mount Moriah and is about ready to kill his son, and he's bound and everything, so he's ready to do it, and he's going to do it when an angel of the Lord comes in, stops him, and says, no, now I know that you fear me, you trust me, and all these promises are indeed going to happen to you. That's a very important moment in not just our history, but culturally in general. As I've said before, we want to be aware of the surrounding cultures and how that might have fed into how we understand the Bible as it was written. And the surrounding religions of Abraham's time, child sacrifice was not an unusual thing. There was one particular pagan god, Melkor, where there was an altar where his arms were out, and it was kind of like a slide into a furnace, and people would take infants and just roll them down and burn them. And there's discrepancy with archaeologists whether they were alive or dead at the time, but the point is child sacrifice and human sacrifice up until that point was not an unusual thing. So God sets himself apart from all other religions and deities by making it very clear he does not want child or human sacrifice at all. So instead, he supplies a ram, and animal sacrifice is how this sort of thing is carried out. Now, when the Israelites were in exile after Egypt, so the Egyptian exile, not the Babylonian, the Egyptian exile. So Moses has gone up to Mount Sinai. He leaves the people in the care of his brother Aaron, and he is given the 10 Commandments on this tablet. And he comes back down ready to tell them, hey guys, we've got these laws, and God is forming a covenant with us. This is hurrah, what the heck is going on here? In Moses' absence, which I think was 40 days, there's a lot of 40 days going on. In his absence, the people have gone to Aaron and said, we want a king, give us a king. And fearing the wrath of the people, Aaron bends to peer pressure and tells them to give him all of their gold. And he melts it down and he creates a golden calf and presents it to them and says, here's the God that rescued you from Egypt. And it's interesting knowing that and then going through, ancient Egypt archaeology and seeing the various idols that they would have come up with. It's very possible that Aaron, who had been a slave working in Egypt, it seems to be that one of his jobs was in some way, working with metals. Anyway, that's side tangent. So the people are worshiping this idol and making a festival for it just as Moses shows up. And he very famously smashes the tablets onto the ground and they break, and then he calls to his side anyone who did not worship this device. And the tribe of Levi, the Levites, come forward, and none of them turned away from God. And the rest of the story there is quite thrilling. I encourage you to read it on your own time. But because the Levites never turned away from God in this moment of, national weakness, the Levites were deemed the only family worthy to take care of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and eventually the temple itself. So, in the Old Testament with the Jewish people, there were only 5 types of offerings that could be done year-round. And they were meant to be gifts, communion, fellowship, and expiation, meaning to heal a rift. We've wronged God, we are separated from him, and this is meant to bridge the gap. And to be clear, it's not something that we've done. We're not the ones thinking of, oh, I bet if I do this thing, then God will forgive me. God has already said, hey, this is what can be done to make this relationship right. The first is one that you are probably familiar with. You would have seen it in art, and if you think offering, this is probably the image that would come to mind. It's a burnt offering of an animal, and it would either be an unblemished cattle, unblemished sheep or goats, or unblemished birds, specifically doves or pigeons. And the reason for these 3 different types of animals is this acknowledged that there was a class system and some people were more well off or poorer than others. And if one family had a flock of cattle and another family would never in a million years have been able to afford a cow, the rich were not the only ones who had a means to be reconciled to God. It was according to what you were able to afford realistically. So, they had to be unblemished, which, again, hearkening back to the time of Cain and Abel, Cain gave the last fruits, and Abel gave the first fruits. Cain gave, arguably, the things that he wouldn't have wanted anyway, whereas Abel gave something that cost him. It didn't break the bank, but it was still a willing and joyful offering that meant something, as opposed to meaning nothing at all, hence why the unblemished bit. So the skin was given to the priests, and everything else would be burned. And also the Levites, this was their full-time job. They were tasked with tending to the tabernacle, offering up these offerings on behalf of the people. The people would give the supplies, but the Levites were the ones who were given clearance to offer it and do the offering and sacrifice itself. And if you're doing that all the time, you don't have time to raise a crop. So this was a way that God set things into motion, that those who are worshiping and who are called to worship the Lord and are answering that call, this is one of the ways that he's provided for them. So, burned or eaten by the priests. The second would be a grain offering. We might be less familiar with that. It would be flour, oil, incense, cooked, uncooked, other, and this was primarily eaten by the priests. When we talked about the layout of the tabernacle, I mentioned something called the table of the showbread, or bread of the presence. In the tabernacle, in the holy place, there was a table of shewbread, and I promised we'd talk about it, and this is the time. It would be 12 loaves of bread, and we think it was probably unleavened to symbolize, the unleavened bread they had at Passover and just before leaving Egypt. But it would be 12 loaves of bread, each representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it would go on the table of shewbread in the holy place for a week. And then when it was time to switch out the bread, because this was holy and the bread of the presence that had been offered to God, it couldn't be thrown away. Nothing that's offered to God is meant to be turned into garbage, which incidentally is why today when we have communion, if there's any leftover wine, you don't pour it down the drain. You either drink it all or you pour it back into the earth. At our church, we've got a back door and a little garden, and they'll, if no one is ready to drink that much, they will pour it into the earth. Anyway, they would switch out the shewbread, or the showbread, the bread of the presence, and then the priests would eat the bread, and they would become the holy vessels for this gift unto the Lord. And there was a an extra contingency there, which was the day leading up to it, the priests, if they had a wife, they weren't allowed to have sex with her the day leading up to it, just so there was no, impure sins that had happened by mistake or intentionally. So they would eat the bread and replace it with the new loaves. So that also was a grain, sort of a grain offering, same ingredients. Anyway, the third offering was an offering of fellowship or peace. It would be a meal that you offered, and this was meant to be a meal with God, the priest, and the people. It was more of a festival type thing instead of it was a happy affair. The next, which you've probably been familiar with, is purification, an offer of purification, where you sinned against God. And this included intentional and unintentional sins. And the Bible does acknowledge that there were things that you knew was wrong and then things that you didn't know was wrong, but they were. And both of them were meant to be covered with the purification offering. And then there was a guilt offering. These were sins against God and your neighbor, and to that end, some form of restitution or payback might have been required. So there might have been a bit of a bill. If they broke something or stole something, they'd have to return it fourfold. I think it was threefold. And so that was the guilt offering. Now, a thing about these offerings is none of them were made for mortal sins, because the part of the point of offerings and sacrifices is we can't atone for our own sins, not when we've defiled and disrespected God in this way. So while these covered the smaller stuff, let's say, none of them could deal with the mortal sins, and they were mostly attended to on the Day of Atonement, which happened one day out of the year. And in our last video, I just mentioned almost in passing that the Day of Atonement was the only day where the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. So whatever religion a person is, one of the things that helps mark them is the holidays they celebrate and the story behind the celebrations. We, as Christians, we celebrate Easter as the day that Jesus, he was dead and he rose again on the third day. And on that third day, we celebrate it for Easter. It tells some of the more important points of our story. And the Jewish people also had certain festivals that told the story, which, remember, they once were slaves. Backing up, they once were nomads who were gonna die out. God formed a covenant with them and said, you will outnumber the stars in the sky and there will be a place for you. And they got there, and then they were made slaves. These people were once slaves. That is so thoroughly ingrained in their identity that it spills out especially into their holidays. When reading the New Testament, Jesus is in Jerusalem a lot, and it might be easy to think, well, he was probably there because he worked there, he lived there. He didn't. Jesus of Nazareth was from Nazareth, but more specifically, the 3 years of his ministry, he was a wandering preacher. He was all over the place. So why was he in Jerusalem all the time? The answer to that is he was a good, law-abiding Jew. And there were 3 particular festivals where if you were a man, you were required to come to Jerusalem to worship and praise God. The first of the 3 Jewish festivals that would bring men to Jerusalem was Passover, or Pesach. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but we're doing our best here. And the Passover was to celebrate and remember their deliverance from Egypt. And it had 2 specific feasts within a week of each other. The Passover, where they remembered the angel of death passing over the Israelites, sparing them, and then killing the firstborn of the Egyptians, most notably Pharaoh's firstborn son. And in the Bible, we see Jesus celebrating the Passover, and we Christians call it the Last Supper, when he takes the bread and the wine, gives thanks to God, and gives it to them, saying, take, eat, this is my body and blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me. he's celebrating the Passover, and the bread and the wine was part of the traditional meal. It also had bitter herbs, lamb, sweet fruit, things like that, and they all had special symbols attached to further tell the story so generations later they would not forget. The second festival that would bring men to Jerusalem was Pentecost, or Shabbat, where they celebrated the Lord giving them the Torah, their laws. And in terms of the year, that is also when they had their reaping festival for wheats and grains. And a thing about the Jewish tradition that's really cool, and it's tied to grains, is God cares an awful lot about the people who have no one else. In their laws, he has certain things where he instructs his people, this is how you take care of the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, the immigrant, the refugee, the poor person, the sick, the wounded. All these people are part of your people, whether they're related to you or not, and they must be taken care of by God's people. And one of the ways this was carried out was through a tradition called gleaning. Now, when you were reaping, the wheat reapers, they would, grab the wheat, cut it, and they would carry it, and they'd put it into bundles, and then they would thrash it, where they had this big pitchfork, and they would, and they'd throw it up, and they'd sift it and everything, and the wind would carry the chaff away, and all that would be left eventually after hours of work would be the grains, and then you could mash it up and then make it into something you can eat. But if you dropped anything that you had harvested on the ground, you weren't allowed to pick it up again. That was for the gleaners who would be following behind the reapers. So if you've got the hired hands, who are the reapers, and they're cutting and they're dropping stuff because accidents happen, behind are the reapers. These were the widow, the orphan, the poor, the immigrant, the refugee, the etc. and so forth, the underdogs, the outcasts, the people who needed help. And they were allowed to come up behind and gather up everything that had been left. And in doing this, it was a community activity where they were working not exactly alongside, but right behind. And so they're working alongside these people, and they're able to earn their food in a way that they don't have to feel ashamed. They don't have to feel awkward about receiving a handout. They are earning their food in a really practical way that any other way they probably wouldn't be able to. And in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, there's a story in the book of Ruth about a young woman named Ruth who is, I think she's a Moabite, and her husband was a Jew, and he died. And eventually, she and her mother-in-law, Naomi, returned to Israel because, Naomi wants to go back to her homeland, and Ruth, who has grown to really love Naomi and see her as her own mother, famously tells Naomi, your people, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And Naomi has taught Ruth about the one true God, even though they were in a land where there were all these other idols that people worshipped. Ruth became a Gentile, essentially, where she really worshipped and served the Lord. And so when the two of them come back to Israel, Naomi, she's too old to work, but Ruth, who's quite sprightly, she becomes a gleaner and, starts gathering the stuff behind the people who are harvesting, and she catches the eye of the owner of the field, a man named Boaz, who's described as a very righteous man. And I hope to do this story later on in a video if this continues. But the point is, the two of them get married, and Ruth is the great-grandmother of the man who becomes King David. And so this story is a very joyful and really beloved story for the Jewish people, which is why during their reaping festival, where they're harvesting the wheat, they remember their nation's kind of great-grandmother Ruth, and they read her story. And also with Pentecost, we see it being worshipped in the Bible in Acts 2. Christians, we celebrate it as the day the Holy Spirit came down and lit up the apostles' heads, and they started speaking in tongues, and they were able to communicate the good news to all the Jews who were in the area. But it talks about how all these Jews were from all over the nation, from all these other countries, and they had come into town, they'd come to Jerusalem because it was the Passover, because if you were a male Jew and you had the means at all, that is what you did. And there's a really cool parallel there, because as the Jews celebrate the receiving of the law and the formation of they become Jews at that point. Beforehand, they were just sort of a remnant group of people, but in receiving the law, they become a religion, they become this very specific culture. And in the church, in receiving the Holy Spirit, we become the church. The third pilgrimage that would bring a Jewish man to Jerusalem was the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths, or Sukkot. And that was to celebrate or to remember the 40 years in the wilderness. So remember, they received the Torah, they leave Egypt, they receive the Torah, they're wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years because they keep on turning away from God. And they're nomads during that time. And part of the Jewish tradition, and devout Jews today may still do this, is they would set up booths. Some might do tents, but you would be living for a week outside, and you would tell the story again, and you would read from the scriptures again. And this was actually a really, it was the holiest of festivals. It was also considered to be, a celebration where you would wait for the coming of the Lord, the coming of the Messiah. And while Pentecost was the reaping festival for things like wheat, Feast of Tabernacles was a harvest festival where things like certain fruits and other foods would be harvested. And we see Jesus celebrating the Feast of Booths, of Tabernacles, in John 7. We don't get to see him, doing all the different things that the Jewish people did, but it does comment how Jesus was in Jerusalem because it was the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to skip ahead a little bit to Hanukkah, and this one's listed for primarily two reasons. The first is you've heard of it. Hanukkah in the States, at least, is celebrated in December when we're celebrating Christmas. There's a little bit of an overlap. It's celebrated for 8 days, and it's commemorating two things mostly. First, the rededication of the second temple. So remember, the first temple is seized and destroyed by the Babylonians, and then while later, 70 years later, Nehemiah is allowed to come back and rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And the Hanukkah, they celebrate the rededication of the temple. And part of the origin of Hanukkah is there was a rebellion between the Greek, I blanked on the word, occupation. Between the Greek occupation and the Roman occupation, there was a rebellion with the Maccabees. We don't have the book of Maccabees. There's some people who have the book of Maccabees. There's a lot of beheadings and fascinating ways to die. Anyway, the Maccabees had a rebellion, and there was a miracle where the oil was going to run out really soon, but it lasted for 8 more nights. And this was a symbol to them that God wanted them to have the land back, and he wanted them to succeed. And which is why the menorah that they use to celebrate has just as many lights. But the other reason this is listed, apart from you've heard of Hanukkah and its rededication of the temple, which further tells the story, but Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, and it's marked in John 10, verses 22 to 23. It talks about him walking around in the temple because he was celebrating the Feast of Lights. And where today we say Hanukkah, because that was, the language, it translated to the Feast of Lights, or the candles that did not go out. So that's something that he celebrated then and is celebrated today, which I think is just really, really fun, which is why it's included. Now, the final festivals we're going to be talking about today are closely tied to one another, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the Jewish New Year, and it's in mid-September. Our calendar year starts on January 1st. Rosh Hashanah is mid-September, and for the church calendar, our first day of the church year is the first Sunday in Advent, because remember, the way we celebrate our festivals and the celebrations we have tells our story. So that's the first day of their new year, and they have 10 days of awe and contemplation where they try to do good deeds, because 10 days later is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or the day the Book of Life is sealed. And their tradition is in these 10 days, the Lord is writing down the names of those who will be in the Book of Life, so when they die, they can, go to heaven and stuff. And it is sealed on the Day of Atonement, which is why they're hoping that by giving offerings and doing good deeds, if their name isn't in the Book of Life, it will be now. Historically, it marks the day of the golden calf, which is slightly different from the giving of the Torah. So there's the giving of the Torah and the sealing of the covenant, which is supposed to be a day of rejoicing, but the Day of Atonement is very somber and, a day of serious repentance and fasting. It's actually the only day in the Jewish year where you're required to fast, which is interesting because the Pharisees would fast Mondays and Thursdays every week, even though they didn't have to. The only day of fasting that was universally required was for Yom Kippur, which was 25 hours, not 24, and I'm not sure why it's 25. But it was the day they remembered and repented of the golden calf. It was also to remember the 4 days of destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple. And again, it's the only day of the year where only the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies. The rest of the year, no one else is allowed to go in there at all. It was just for this one somber day. The closest the Christians have to Yom Kippur would likely be Good Friday, where we have, instead of Passover, we remember Maundy, Thursday, and some churches actually do have a Passover feast. For us, we don't have to do the Day of Atonement because Christ died once for all and for many for the forgiveness of sins eternally. Part of the Day of Atonement was meant to, ask for forgiveness for the mortal sins, but it was also aware that it probably wasn't enough. Jesus, the sacrificial lamb and the Son of God, who did no sin and gave his life anyway, he is the ultimate sacrifice, so we don't have to do this Day of Atonement. There are some Christians who do make a point to observe all of these holidays because, fact of the matter is the Christian existence, we stem from the Jews. The difference is they're waiting for the Messianic king, the Davidic king, and we're waiting for this king to come back. But you can see certain parallels with the festivals we celebrate and the why. Time for a biblical interpretation snippet to send you on your way. Offerings. As mentioned before, sacrifices and offerings were not meant to financially ruin you. They were a way for everyone, regardless of class or state, to be able to reconcile with God. And because of that, there was a sort of class system, if you will, of what was expected for you to offer, depending on your financial means. So the richer you were, the bigger the animal it would be, the poorer you were, the smaller the animal, and more affordable, which is why we know that Jesus' parents, his mother Mary and his adopted father Joseph, the two of them, this family was poor. Because in the book of Luke, it talks about on the 8th day, Jesus was taken to the second temple, Herod's temple, to be circumcised, which was a tradition of the Jewish boys. On their 8th day, they would be circumcised. And Mary and Joseph offered up an offering of 2 birds. Now, the offering is interesting. It wasn't for Jesus. It was for Mary because she was considered impure, having just been given birth. Now, there's the intentional sin, the unintentional sin, and then there's sort of just the, you're dirty right now. And one of the circumstances was if you were actively bleeding in some way. If you were wounded and bleeding, you weren't supposed to be touched because of the blood. And a woman who was bleeding because of her menstrual cycle or had just given birth, she was considered unclean as well. And before any feminists start going, that's so unfair, think about when you're actively bleeding. Do you want anyone to touch you? That's what I thought. It was a mercy gift. Anyway, because a woman was considered impure having just given birth, within a week, when her son is being circumcised, or within that week, she was expected to give a purification offering. And in Mary's case, because she and her husband were really poor, it would have been birds. And then after that offering, she was considered purified, but a Jewish woman was also required to stay home for 33 more days after the purification offering was given, ideally to rest her body if anything else was going on, any complications of health and blood, so that way if you were still bleeding in some way and were not clean yet, you wouldn't unintentionally defile anything else. Now, is this fun fact vital for our salvation? No, not really. But does it help us understand the Bible as a whole that much better and make the entire Bible that much cooler? Well, yeah.